right, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's call, and just administratively, if we could ask that everybody mute out on their Microsoft Teams environment, just to minimize any respectful back noise that might be happening. Okay. Well, once again, welcome to today's call. It's all about leading and managing through adversity. That's today's topic. And on our call, we have a number of different presenters. My name is Pat Lipovsky. I'm the CEO and founder of the Envision Group. And we're an organization, of course, that really turns strategy into results. Today, we have on the call Scott Donald. If you'd like to say a quick hello, Scott.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well today, and we look forward to spending the next approximately 90 minutes with you.
All right, thanks, Scott. And also on the line from Dallas, Texas, we have Bob Peterson. Would you like to say hello, Bob?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully we'll be able to relay some tips, advice, useful actions you might take as we work our way through the coronavirus and the oil shock. So glad to be here and glad to share some of my experience with you guys.
All right, thanks, Bob. And to start today's presentation, we also have Dr. Hugh Dunleavy with us from Austin, Texas. Hugh, if you'd like to say hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to the session. Glad you could all make it, and hopefully we'll be able to pass on some useful tips and guidance that we've developed over the years working in different environments. So look forward to the session, and please feel free to be open with any questions or chats you would like to present to us during the day.
All right, thanks, Hugh. And just for everybody's benefit, Scott and I are both pleased to have both Bob and Hugh on the call today, in the sense that, Bob Peterson is a seasoned oil and gas strategy expert, and he's been literally working within the industry. He's been through 4 major price cycles with oil, as well as 2 minor pandemics. He'll touch on that in just a little bit of time here. And Bob's here to share his learnings of how to navigate personally, as teams and families, and corporately through this tricky environment that we're all living through. Now, Dr. Hugh Dunleavy on the call here today. An interesting background on Hugh, was an executive with Malaysia Airlines at the time that they had the unfortunate tragedies of losing MH370 and MH17, and we'll be talking about that. Our agenda for today includes the following, doesn't it, Scott?
Yeah, I'm going to take myself off of mute. Thank you, Pat. So again, we've done the introductions of the 4 people that will be running the agenda. We're going to go over some examples, specifically an example that will be very compelling by Dr. Hugh about his experiences with Malaysia Airlines. And then we're going to do a bit of an evolution, talking about tips and tricks for managing and leading yourself and taking good care of yourself, which is the foundation for then being able to lead teams and eventually leading organizations. And that's what we'll bring Bob in to provide some more background experience on that. So it will be a lively, interactive 90 minutes. And I think, as Hugh said, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll be sure to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and thanks, Scott. So it's interesting. The agenda is set, but, just to bring Hugh into the conversation now, Dr. Dunleavy, as everybody refers to you, it's interesting because one morning about 6 years ago, you were actually on your way to work as a senior executive of Malaysia Airlines. And about 4:30 a.m., your phone rang, and it changed your life and many other lives as you know it. Can you take us through a little recounting of that situation?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And I'm going to talk about the MH370 and MH17 and try and bring some relevance to those experiences with what we're experiencing during the pandemic. And I know it may sound strange, but typically when there's ever an aircraft incident, typically, an aircraft is on the ground somewhere, a crash, whatever has happened, emergency services are activated, and they're immediately dispatched to the crash site. They do everything in their power to rescue the survivors and recover the deceased. And then they secure the site and commence the investigation process. And while that's all going on, of course, the airline has to continue with its business activities. First responders then work with the families of the survivors and the survivors, if there are any. And there's a relatively very short timeline, as everyone knows, that an accident has occurred. However, with MH370, there was no such thing as a crash site. There was no information available on what really happened, when it happened, where it happened, or how, what came to pass. And that triggers typically in the human mind much speculation, lots of theories, and a need for a steady update to families and media as new information is received. And of course, when there is no information, people will fill in gaps with conspiracy theories that abound all over the place. And there's no need for these conspiracy theories to go and find data to back them up. No official information. They just put a conspiracy theory out there, and if it sounds appropriate enough, then it gets spread very quickly and becomes viral. But in our case, we had to search for the aircraft over more than a year's period. And that's where an incident like an aircraft crash and MH370 diverge, because now we're talking about an incident that's extended over a year or more, with intense worldwide interest in what happened to the aircraft, and trying to find out where it finally resides, which now 6 years later we still don't know.
Oh,
So
it said
sorry.
red, but then I looked back and then it said it hasn't.
Sorry, did someone come on the line there? Is everyone able to hear me?
Yep, carry on, Hugh. I think someone just took themselves off of mute for a second.
Oh, okay. All right. So, so from our perspective, we weren't dealing with an incident. We're dealing with something equivalent to a pandemic where it extended for more than a year, and we didn't know when the scenario would end, nor did we know what the final outcome would be, nor did we understand what the scale of the incident was. So there were political aspects. There were dedicated hacker attacks. I mean, at one stage, we were having more than 4 million attacks or hits per second against our website, trying to bring it down and damage even further the brand and equity that was in the Malaysia Airlines information. Lots of inaccuracies were received, mainly from different sources of information. And believe it or not, lots of government information you receive is not as accurate as you'd like it to be. And when you as the airline representative pass that on to people, and it doesn't turn out to be as accurate as you thought it was, then there's implications in terms of the trust they have in your information. So we learned very quickly that trust is important. And therefore, when you present information to them that I had received from other agencies, then I had to prefix every statement by saying, here's the information received. Where I was allowed to specify the source of the information, I would provide it and say this information may change at some time in the future as more information was received, but it's the best information we have today. And it was important to do that because without that, there's no trust from the family members of the passengers and crew that were on board. And once you've lost their trust, then anything else you say in the future is going to be dismissed very, very quickly. So the main thing for me was to take care of the family members, give them hope for the future, communicate and demonstrate professionalism to make sure that they understand that we'll get through this, but it's going to be a journey, not just a simple event. And then just as you think you're getting through this, 3 or 4 months later, we had the second incident, very different environment where MH17 was shot down over the Ukraine. Now we actually had an incident, aircraft was shut down, and you'd think therefore we'd go into the normal scenario to rescue any passengers that had survived. But in this case, there were no survivors. But in addition, because of the fighting that was going on the ground, we couldn't actually get to the crash site for 6 weeks. It all got integrated with the MH370 scenario, and it just made more and more media attention for it. And that just exacerbated the problem for the airline as we were fighting to bring the airline back into normal operating mode, but could not do so. Then the usual things come out from different sources was saying, well, why was a commercial airline flying over a war zone? As if we, Malaysia Airlines, had done something wrong, whereas in fact, all air traffic corridors are designated by an organization called ICAO, ICAO. This is United Nations organization that specifies safe flight corridors, because that's where traffic control radar then monitor where the aircraft are, so we know where everything is in the sky. But suddenly it was now we had done something wrong, even though there were probably 20 aircraft along the same flight corridor around about the same time, just separated by 5 or 10 miles distance and at different altitudes. But again, you're still trying to run a business. You're trying to deal with family members in China. Now we're dealing with family members in the Netherlands as well. And everyone wants to try and help you. So as an example, we had 13 different Dutch emergency services, all wanting to contact family members, all wanting to participate because they've been training all their lives to do that. And I'm saying to them, no, you cannot do that, because these people are going through a massive stress in their lives. Loved ones have been lost. and you want to let me allow 13 different agencies talk to them. So we had to try and get them and the Dutch government aligned to say, we'll do a contact, we'll do it one time during the day, we'll give them an update, and we'll ask the family members who they would like to speak to, what support services they would need. And when they have made that decision, then we'll contact you, but we're not going to give you their names and addresses to do that stuff. So again, the same thing, it took time, and it moved from being an incident to a long-term issue that we as an airline had to take care of and move on from. And as I said at the start, MH370 is still something that Malaysia Airlines is still worried about, because 6 years later, we still haven't found where that aircraft rests. So with that, I'll try and turn it back to Pat.
Yeah.
But that's where there's that correlation between the pandemic and the scenario we have today with the spread of the virus, and where we had to deal with an ongoing event in the airline case that was very different than what any airline had experienced in the past.
Well, Hugh, it's interesting because, looking back, and I know we've talked about this a number of times, first off, what a tragedy. And I know that, there were many, many learnings that came from this. Every time something happens in the airline industry responds, recovers, and corrects to resume in ways that ensure that that situation won't happen again. Now, it's interesting because on the screen right now is an image of you, and this was probably a daily image, 3 times a day for over 4 months. And this was, just imagine for all of us on the call, being the leader who the media, the families, the stakeholders, the governments, everybody's looking to find out information. And this was the daily scrum 3 times a day. Is that correct?
That is correct. The photograph of the plane, that's actually the reconstruction of MH17, because we're able to get to that aircraft. And then as part of our normal investigation with the various, with Boeing, the aviation authorities in both the United States and in Malaysia, we reconstruct the aircraft. But at the same time, for MH370, because of the mysteriousness of what happened to the aircraft, families wanted to be updated all the time, and the media had an interest. And so you had media from all over the world trying to get information from you. And we were able to control that in the sense that whilst everyone wanted information, they wanted their own scoop. The truth was you have to provide the right information to everyone at the same time. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, 12 noon and 5 p.m. each day, we'd have a formal presentation of what we knew at that instant in time. And then because you can't just then walk away, you'd have a scrum session where everyone would just bombard you with their own questions for their own media outlet. And you have to spend time with them to let them know what's going on. Because if you just simply walk away, then someone will come up again with some weird conspiracy theory that you're hiding information from them. So we took the time to be with them, but most of all, I spent a lot of my time with the family members, just listening to them. Even though they didn't necessarily speak English, it was important to spend time with them and just listen as they expressed their grief and got through their various stages of grief, which I know you'll be talking about a little bit later, Pat.
Yeah, we will. And it's interesting, Hugh, because, looking at the situation, MH370, MH17, as tragic as it was, you came out with learnings. And what's interesting is we've really formed, the first learning is looking at what's on the screen right now. We call this the roller coaster of change. And what happens, first thing in the morning, 4:30 a.m., your phone rings and it's blind optimism and maybe a little shock and denial. This couldn't have happened.
That is correct.
Yeah, and how long did it take you, again, to go from the blind optimism, shock and denial down to the pit of despair as we all transition through this change?
We got to the, so let's say at about 4:30 when I got the first call out to about 9 a.m. So about just under 5 hours. That was the length of time it took us to get to that pit of despair. And at each stage going down to that pit, we were hoping that something would arise. Someone would contact us, say they've regained contact with the aircraft. But by the time we got to 9 a.m. in the morning, that was the time the aircraft should have landed in Beijing. And so once the aircraft did not land in Beijing and we'd never been able to track it through Chinese airspace, then we knew something really serious had happened. We obviously were treating it very seriously because we activated all of our first responders and emergency response, but we didn't know exactly where the incident was, where we could send things. We couldn't even send out search and rescue because we had no idea of where to send them. So so it took us about 5 hours to get to that bottom.
Whereas with MH17, what was the difference in the time it took you to get down to the pit of despair with MH17?
MH17 was probably about 5 minutes. Because at that stage, because it was an aircraft that was shot down, there was smoke on the ground, there was wreckage, there were other aircraft passing along the same flight corridor. They would call into their own airlines that something bad had happened, a commercial airline had gone down. They didn't know what the source was, that it was a missile attack, but they knew an aircraft was on the ground. And our own, we had other aircraft from London, from Paris, etc., all separated by maybe about half an hour time spread, also flying down. They contacted us, and the only aircraft that didn't respond was MH17 from Amsterdam. So when we were calling that aircraft to find out if they were okay and they weren't responding, then we knew literally almost immediately that it was our aircraft that had been shot down or had gone down. We didn't know at that stage it was a missile attack.
Now, Hugh, from the learnings of both tragedies, it's interesting because you look at the adversity we're all living through right now. Some people call it the pit of despair, and other people call it the long runway of despair. Can you comment on that?
Yes, because in the case of MH17, let's say we took 5 hours to get to the bottom of the pit. It wasn't a quick climb out. That took us years to recover and get the airline back, and it would be 2 steps forward, 1 step back because of all the media attention to what was going on as new information was received. The different theories, different new mechanisms to try and track the aircraft were coming along, and they'd do some more searching. They'd have high optimism, but then it would fail. So it was probably several years to get out of that scenario. So you spent a long time at the bottom of that trough before you could start climbing out. And you're right, that was not a V shape. It was much more like a drop down, and then a very long horizontal piece at the bottom of that despair level, and then a gradual climb out to get the airline operating again.
Well, it's interesting, Hugh, because from our conversations and from the learnings of both tragedies, you've really come to the. I know in the conversation you came up with these 4 different phases of crisis management, or even 4 phases of dealing with adversity. Where first you have to recognize something's happened, then you have to respond to it, and then of course as you respond, you start to think about and plan recovery, and then resume day-to-day life. And what's interesting about this is in the chat room, if everybody can go about 2/3 of the way down the middle of their screen and click on the conversation box, if you don't mind clicking on that, you got to recognize first that we're through this, price shock of oil and COVID-19. Then we have to respond to it. Now, how many of you have moved from responding to recovering, and how many people feel like you're recovering to resume? If you could put in the chat room now, just to get an idea of where everybody on this call is at, what number do you think you're at? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Just put one single number just to get an idea of where you think you are. Either type in the word or the number, doesn't matter. So isn't that interesting? A few weeks ago, a lot of people, the majority, if not all of the people, we were on a call with another organization, and the majority of the people were still at respond. And so we see a lot of balance of 2s and 3s, a little bit more on the 3 side.
Yeah, we're seeing a bit more 3s now than 2s. We're seeing but it's mostly 2s and 3s. It doesn't appear that anyone is still at the recognized phase, and no one's admitting that they feel like they're at the resumption phase. So a bit more of a balance between 2s and 3s than what we saw a couple weeks ago.
So isn't that interesting? So you look at it, the stage that you might be at. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through and talk about some tips to help us as individuals first, because Hugh, when you fly in an aircraft and there's if there, God forbid, there was an emergency and the oxygen masks drop, whose mask are we supposed to put on first?
The first guideline is put the mask on yourself so that you're able to still function, then help anyone else beside you. So look after yourself first, because if you don't and try and help someone else and then you lose consciousness, you're not much help to anyone else.
No.
Take care of yourself first, then anyone else.
Well, so it's interesting. You look at the recognizing. Here's part of the recognition is COVID-19. U.S. population, 326 million. Canada, roughly 10% of that at 37 million. U.S. COVID cases as of this morning was 1,347,000. Canadian cases, 71,264. So, it's interesting because the COVID-19 mortality rate compared to the flu It's a 3.5% mortality versus a 0.1% of the flu. And a lot of us heard at the very front end, well, isn't this just the flu? So, that's part of the recognizing what we're truly under. And one thing is a caveat, we're not medical experts. We're putting up information, of course, from the Johns Hopkins that we've been finding. And also there's an app that you can download for your phone to really keep on top of Canadian numbers for those of us north of the border. But really, the scale is unknown. And Hugh, can you say anything to this? Like, really the social distancing, a bit of a must these days, personally, corporately? Sorry, Hugh, I think you just muted out there.
My system did a major reboot of the Teams application. I don't know if anyone else had the same problem. So I'm now back in. Now, the challenge is that when we say we've got this many cases, what we should really say is we should be a little bit more specific and say the known cases we have is this number, all right, 1,347,000. The actual number of cases may be 10 times bigger, 20 times bigger. We just don't know because we've not tested enough, all right? And if we had tested more people and more people are recovering, maybe the mortality rate is a lot less than the current rate we're seeing. So there's a lot of unknowns out there, and that's the challenge there. We are making decisions under a high degree of uncertainty, and that the information we're receiving on a daily basis can significantly influence the type of decisions that we'd like to make. And so that's my main comment here, is that when you're dealing with uncertainty, it's flexibility and adaptability that are going to become key to how you as an organization operate. I know we'll be touching on that a little bit later, Pat, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Now, Bob, it's interesting because I found a 5-year chart of the price of crude, and it looks like somebody melted towards the right-hand side of that in 2020. There's a little bit of a melt to this chart. But Bob, from all of your years in oil and gas, 40 years within this industry, what can you say about this chart?
Well, I think, first of all, it's quite remarkable. We have never experienced such a rapid demand drop in the history of the oil industry. Now, we will recover. I think the recovery will likely be over a number of years. It's not going to be a quick, as the economists say, a V-shaped recovery. It's likely to be more, as Nike says, a swoosh-shaped recovery. And I think, as I said, demand will come back. In my experience, having been in executive positions through now about 4 significant price shocks, the industry will change structurally. And generally speaking, what I've seen is the structural changes are directly proportional to the depth and the length of the price shock. So we'll see consolidations, we'll see opportunities for the nimble firms to adjust their strategy and grow, but the world will look quite different with respect to the energy sector in 2021, 2022.
Well, so Bob, it's interesting with the whole price adjustment. The importance for leading ourselves through some of this has probably been a pretty big thing. So, Bob, we'll come back to you in just a moment if that's all right, because, Scott, looking at these 4 phases of leading self, it's going to be interesting as we go through these different phases. Here's the roller coaster, Scott, as you and I had put up here. Here's the roller coaster with not the stages of how you navigate crisis and change, but these are really the typical feelings that you'd feel as you go through that roller coaster, aren't they?
Right. So this is taking a bit more of a personal view of each individual, and what we're learning from talking with our clients and from interviewing and talking to Hugh. A couple of key things here is that this isn't a cookie cutter kind of approach, because you're going to have some people that are very much at the left side of the roller coaster still. It sounds like for a lot of people, if you look at it from an organizational standpoint, we're seeing most people have either hit the bottom or starting to come back up again. So you're seeing a bit of acceptance, and we're starting, as our poll here indicated, we're seeing a lot of people are at 2 and more people are at 3. And I think why this is really relevant as leaders, And again, I'm going to refer back to what we're learning from our clients and from talking to Hugh, is that it's really important for us to have those conversations and identify where our team is at. So are they on the fear and depression side of the scale, or are you seeing them move towards acceptance? How can we, once we've identified that, how can we help them get there? And I think one of the things that really struck me, and I'm gonna refer to Hugh again, is a lot of times it's just simply asking the questions and listening, and just being there for them. And that's one of the tools that we can leverage as we help our teams move from the left side to the right side of the personal roller coaster.
Well, and let's talk about that for a second, because the questions to ask yourself, we're going to put it down into 4 areas, because an emotional time, emotion can get the best of us. So here's some questions to really ponder and consider. And one thing we can say is, if anybody on this call, we'll have our email address at the very end of this presentation. If you want a copy of the deck to share it with others, personally or professionally, we're happy to share this out and to give you all of the content of our presentation in the sake of abundance. We just want to make sure we're sharing this, because look at the physical items. They're on here. Are you accomplishing and doing each one of these? Psychological, are you actually getting away from the noise and the news? CTV and CNN seem to have these really crazy, depressing music themes to their newscasts that can really bring down the most positive of person. You look at the emotional side. Are we pausing to think? Are we commencing to think? Are we letting people who are going through the roller coaster be heard, and just to listen to their frame of mind? And even for community, are we asking for help? Are we showing gratitude to others? Are we demonstrating calm, which is a pretty important thing, and we'll come back to that. And I know, Scott, even some of the tips on this page, you've got some of your favorites on this one as well, don't you?
Yeah, I actually just making sure that I didn't put myself back on mute again. So, there's a couple that I'll just very quickly touch on, and it goes back to the whole idea of self. So, take care of yourself. So again, in Hugh's example of the airline industry, put on your own oxygen mask first. So, and how do you stay healthy? So now we're talking sleep and exercise and your eating. And if you feel that one of the ways you cope is to go for a walk, then go for a walk. If you like, listen, take care of yourself. And the other one that I'm going to touch on very quickly, and I think I might be stealing Hugh's thunder here on this one, is have a purpose. So every day, have something like a vision of a purpose that you're working towards, so that every day you have a reason. You have a reason to get up. You have a reason to go and support your team, support your family. And again, as Hugh and Pat have said before, you've got your work family and you have your at-home family. So stay healthy for them and have a purpose to give you a reason to get up and go every day.
And Hugh, from your words, why is having a purpose so important to you? As you were going through the 2 tragedies that you led through, why was it important for you as an individual to have a purpose?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because I'd like to say there was a single purpose, but typically it ends up with multiple purposes. They're all aligned, but my first purpose there was to talk to the family members, let them know that we as an airline were going to take care of them, that we were going to do everything in our power to investigate what had happened to the aircraft and therefore to their loved ones, and also give them some hope that we would get through this together. So that's why we had to be very positive about it, but we also had to be very honest with them so that they knew we need to make sure that they trusted us for the information, because as we can see today, with such partisan type information, depending on which channel you listen to, you either have one view of the world, and if you listen to another channel, you have a completely diametrically opposite view of the world. And the truth lies somewhere between the two. Where it is, I'm not going to say, but the point is, have a purpose, which in our case was be there for the family members to talk to, have someone they could go to as a point of reference. I was there. My second purpose was to represent the Malaysian government to the Chinese government, make sure they had a central point of contact. So I spent a lot of time with the ambassador working with the Chinese authorities. And I must admit, the Chinese authorities were incredibly helpful. They gave us all the support that I needed to make sure we took care of the people and made sure we had access to hotel rooms, hospital, medical facilities, etc. And the third one, which probably was just as important as taking care of the family members, was taking care of my team of first responders. they are going through an enormous level of stress because they have families of their own and they have jobs to take care of. But at the same time, they knew that they'd been trained to take care of the family members and give them some relief. And I made sure that most of my team members that I had in Beijing were fluent Mandarin speakers so that they could communicate well with each other. They also knew very quickly that I did not speak Mandarin, but that didn't stop them from wanting to speak to me. So they needed to have someone they could talk to. They needed someone they wanted to hold accountable, and they needed someone who was senior enough in the organization so that if I said something, they could take that as I spoke on behalf of the airline, not that I had to bump it up to the chain of command to get to the board of directors. I was the one that was making statements that would commit the airlines to a course of action. Very
Absolutely.
For the family members.
And it's interesting, Hugh, sort of jump in, it's just interesting because as you go through, making sure that you've got yourself in a good place is obviously the first thing. The next thing that Scott and I want to talk about now, it's leading teams. And as everybody in the call, if you don't lead a team, you may be a part of a family, which I would only hope to think. And it's interesting because, for each one of us to be leaders for our families, for our group of friends, for our social connections, some of the tips, once we actually feel like we've got our oxygen mask on tight, it's pretty safe to say that we can still go through all of these 4 phases and help others through our own learnings and through their own situation. So, it's interesting because in times of a crisis, what we have is we have 4 items. Look after your people, period. Right, Scott?
Yeah. And again, Hugh's touched on this quite a bit from his experience with MH17 and MH370. The people are your work family. And once you've provided the foundation of taking care of yourself, they become your next priority. And again, Hugh can talk to this in greater detail. And now part of how you do that is you paint a vision for what things will look like when they return to normalcy. And whether that's next week, next month, next year, that's still to be determined, which is why this is challenging for people because we don't really know where it's going to be, but you can paint a vision of what you believe it's going to look like and start to work towards that, which is where step 3 comes in. And really, this is where you're looking to encourage and empower everybody. And again, so part of listening means listening to how they feel, what their fears are, what their hopes are, but also what their ideas are. So what are their ideas for helping their team or your organization move through this crisis? And the last one is just simply acknowledge, while you may not have all the answers, you can acknowledge that these are difficult times and that these are going to be difficult decisions to be made. But if you do them together as a team, you're much more likely to get through with everybody on the same page and help everybody transition from the left side to the right side of the organizational and personal roller coaster.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you look at the whole idea of encouraging and enabling others. When you're encouraging others to really get involved and do things, you do have to demonstrate, like, Hugh, when you're standing in front of that camera, when you're standing in front of family members in Beijing, in response to MH370, was it important to really demonstrate a sense of calm, but at the same time, realistic optimism?
Yeah. I don't think I'd use the word optimism in the case of MH370 or MH17, but you do have to present, you have to be calm, you have to present professionalism, and you have to be able to state the information and the source of information to give confidence to the people that when they talk to you, they're getting the whole story, not just part of a story, or not that I'm spinning something to make the airline look good, et cetera, then you just lose trust. So it is important to be professional, calm, confident, and focus on telling them the truth. And sometimes that's hard, but that's what your job is. If you don't establish trust with your colleagues, your team members, your family, that's a bad place to be. So that is so critical.
Well, why would it be important these days during COVID and price shock of oil? Why would it be important to be calm and to really communicate a realistic optimism today?
Because as I think Bob touched on earlier, and I know Bob will talk about it a bit later on in the presentation, is that, yes, we're in this crisis today. Yes, there are a lot of unknowns out there, but it will pass. We don't know when it will pass. And what our task is as leaders is to provide that confidence that there is a path forward. We will find it. There may be some side steps along the way, but we'll find a way through this and we'll come out stronger at the end. That to me is one role of leadership, is to make sure that people start believing in you, but that it's free to admit that you don't know all the answers. There will be new information coming through every day. And so to pretend that we have the answers to every possible scenario that will arise just makes you look ridiculous. So admit what you know, and also admit what you don't know, and that you're going to work your way through it.
Well said. You know, it's also interesting too, because as you go through a tricky time, one reminder for each one of us, and I have to remind myself about this daily, it's taking the perspective not of you, but of the person standing in front of you or the people around you. You know, it's considering their emotion, and most important, withholding judgment. And, you know, again, Hugh, from your experience, why would the combination, and by the way, the center of all those is where empathy intersects. Why would you say it's important to follow through with each one of those three items?
Yeah, because in the end, it's not about me. It's about the people that you're dealing with. You have to take their perspective, because, and I gave an example that when I was in Beijing, I would spend a lot of time just walking through and being visible to the family members. And I would normally have a translator with me, but sometimes I would sit down and just listen to the family members. They would only speak Chinese to me, but they just wanted to show me pictures of their family members that were on board the aircraft and express their feelings to me. They knew I didn't speak Chinese, and sometimes I had to stop my translator from speaking. I said, just let them speak and just show to me their emotions about losing their family members, and have someone that they could show their emotion to. And I'm not going to judge them. They're just trying to tell me this is how important their family members were to them. These are the impacts. And afterwards, I would get the translator to tell me what exactly was going on. But for the people at the time, it was not much about me speaking to them. It was about the emotional release and knowing that there was someone there listening to them and could empathize with them. That really is critical.
Well, and it's interesting to sit back and pardon me to bring a little humor into the conversation here, but in the true words of Joey Tribbiani from Friends, it's how you doing. But it's an important thing to ask people. It's an important question to throw out there, because, other people around us, it's pretty good to be an Oreo cookie. It's to be strong on the outside, but each one of us still have feelings and emotion that we do have to recognize as we go through a tough time. Yes. Right, Scott? How you doing?
I'm still stuck on the Oreo cookie example, to be honest.
Well, it's interesting too, but one of the items when going through a tough time, as leaders, as parents, as friends, as family members, living above the line, Scott, is something that we always default to, because it's probably one of the most important things we include in some of the leadership training we do, isn't it?
Right. So this particular model, which we'll go through here, is one of the more popular models that we work with from a leadership perspective. And essentially how it ties into what we're talking about here really is, and this goes back to what he was talking about, listening. The model here is that as leaders, it's not uncommon that we'll ask, what's the situation, what's not working, what's broken, and it's important to listen. And the example that we give here, and Hugh just touched on it so eloquently, is that we don't always have to have the answers or a response. It's just a matter of listening. But in terms of our teams, from a leadership perspective, there's something that really magical happens when we start to have them envision, pardon the pun, what it's going to look like when it's fixed, right? So making that transition up into the top quadrant there, where we have our teams, and as we empower them and as we engage them, take ownership, accountability, and responsibility. And again, we don't have to have the answers here, but we can say to them, what do you think? What is your vision for how things are going to look as we get out of here? Or what would you suggest that we do that's going to be most effective given the circumstances that we're in? Yeah, not great circumstances, but what can we do to make the best of the situation? And this simple model of listening first and allowing people to be heard, as you referred to, and then helping engage them by saying, well, what do you think we should do? And if they're stuck and they're not sure, then just simply say, well, what do you think would happen if we tried this? And get them to basically have them feel as though they're contributing and collaborating to the vision of how things are going to look like when we return to normal. So living above the line is both figurative and metaphorical in terms of being positive, but also helping people get up into that top half of the quadrant of the living above the line model.
Well, it's interesting, that green line that goes from left to right in the center of the screen. Some people in life resemble the BED, the acronym of lying in bed and letting life pass them by because, the blame, excuses, and denial. But living above the line is having an oar. It's a tool to go someplace. And it's funny how down below the line, there's another professional that was in the same walk of life as we're in leadership development and strategy, talked about flipping over the bed and then using your oar to go somewhere. And speaking of above the line people, I know Brooke Westall's in the call here, and I know, Brooke, you're probably smiling right now because that's something that you've instituted within your own organization. So it's interesting. Blame, excuses, and denial. Living below the line, by the way, is a human default. We're all programmed to think that way, aren't we, Scott?
Yeah. So again, we're not going to get into the science of the human brain, but we think about the function of fight or flight. That is a basic human response. So we're always looking for danger. So it is a natural response to go below the line. And as they teach you, if you're coaching kids in sports or you're coaching and leading teams in business, is look for those positives and look for ways to reward and recognize and support people who are doing the right thing and help them get above that line.
Excellent. And what's interesting about the living above the line is the more we actually encourage it. I know that at one point I was driving down in traffic and my kids from the back seat said, "Hey, Dad, let's bring it above the line." So, this is something that happens in life as well. But, the funny thing is some of the tips to leading families and teams. Yeah, leading teams through adversity. It's interesting, Scott, because I know you've got your favorite on here too.
So I think my first favorite one is the avoid the jerk decisions. Oh, wait, actually that says knee-jerk decisions. So avoid knee-jerk decisions, and this goes back, and again, Hugh talked about this a lot, is gathering facts to help you make smart decisions so that you avoid the knee-jerk decisions. But I think, and again, I'm going to steal this one, I love it, communicate, communicate, communicate. I think a lot of times when you look at things that go really well, it's because there was really good back and forth communication. And when there's opportunities for improvement and we go back and do a bit of a debrief, we realize that we maybe weren't clear in our expectations, or we weren't clear in terms of listening to the person and really understanding what they were trying to say to us.
Well, and Hugh, I know that you've, the communication is of utmost importance to you, but, again, going through the situations where, you think about it before COVID-19 and such a massive price shock in oil, you've led through probably one of the trickiest environments corporately. And do you think mistakes are going to happen by some of us in our families, in our teams, at work and at home? Do you think mistakes are going to happen in days and weeks to come?
And that's what I find in any organization, in any team. Not everything works out the way you planned, right? Mistakes do happen. That doesn't mean people deliberately set out to screw up that day, but things may have fallen off their plate because they got pressure for something else to be done. So things do happen. And I give examples I've taught at presentations where a government agency will have sent me satellite maps and photographs of what they saw on a certain part of the world on a certain day. I present that to grieving family members, only to discover 2 days later, actually, the map we sent you was actually taken at a different time of day and it was a different part of the ocean. And sorry, it was completely wrong. Okay. Can you imagine going then and telling the family members that everything I told you 2 days ago was completely wrong? And guess who they're going to blame? Not the government agency that provided the information, but you, because you're the accountable executive talking to the family members. So when something goes wrong, you own it. You can't go back and say, but. So one of the things I learned very quickly is, as I said, tell them, this is what I know today. Here's the source of information where I can provide it, but it is being updated on a minute by minute basis, and be prepared that if things change, I will tell you about the change. So one thing I also told people, and maybe Bob will talk a bit more, is have that 80% plan. So I'll let Bob chat about that a bit more. But one thing that I'll move to as well is build trust and accountability. If the people will trust you and that the information you provide is correct and that you're the face that they're always seeing, they know that there's someone they can come to. It is your job to address their issues. So having trust and accountability is very critical. And I'd like to hand it back over to Bob to talk about the 80% plan component, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead,
sure.
Bob.
Happy to offer a few comments, Hugh. I think I reflect on a very famous saying from a Prussian general by the name of Clausewitz, who said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." And I think that is extremely relevant here. Things are fast changing. There are a lot of unknown unknowns. Information, the business situation, the commercial situation changes almost daily. So from a planning point of view, organizations, teams, companies really need to be agile. They need to be flexible. They need to adjust as new information comes in. Because if you strive to achieve the 100% plan, it's very likely that the situation will have changed and that plan, part or all of it, will no longer be relevant. So it's important to be agile. It's important to monitor key pieces of information, be it the uptick in energy demand or the spread of the virus or other important telltales that are relevant to your business.
Well, Bob, it's interesting. There's people on the call today that I know that are leaders within business and some owners within business too. And even looking at the facts as we hear it from our respective governments, no matter which border you're living on the right side of or the wrong side of, but not to get into politics. The interesting thing is our governments are actually coming out with information on support plans. And those support plans have changed probably, radically since they first started to come out because, we just have to trust that, they're learning too. And, we can't expect, some of the authorities to have a 100% plan, but we can expect them to be learning as we go as well, just the same way that we are. What's interesting, though, is we've got a few other points here, and these are actually interesting to highlight as well. Hugh, what can you say about this slide here in terms of some of the tips? Which one's your favorite one on here?
Yeah, I mean, all of them are important, but the one that I'll just discuss is, exude calm. The reason for that is that if you're not calm and you keep jumping from one solution to another or one action to another, and you're presenting that information to your team who are going to go out and execute it, and you keep flip-flopping from one direction to another, then they're going to lose all confidence in you as a leader because they'll stop listening to you in the morning because they know whatever you told me to do in the morning, by the time the afternoon has come along, because a new set of information has been received, then you'll jump to a new direction. So the important point is that exude calm doesn't mean stop and do nothing. It means take the information in, take the time to analyze it, integrate it with the other information you've got, and then make a decision and then communicate why you've made that decision and what might happen in the future that would change that decision. So long as your people know that you're taking the information seriously, you're analyzing it, integrating into a plan, and then communicating it properly to your people, then you become across as a professional person who's confident in their own skills and capabilities, and then you behave as a leader is required to behave to get people to follow you.
Yeah, thanks, you. It's interesting, Scott. I just keep on thinking of focus on the future. I keep on thinking of the campground, the ski hill, and back on the beach in Hawaii. But which one's your favorite on the screen here yourself?
My favorite's going to be stay busy and productive, and I think that goes back to the earlier slide about having a purpose. So, you do your analysis, you figure out what your purpose is, and then you get to it. You stay busy and be productive, and you're going to be constantly reevaluating, but figure it out, head down, get to it, and work with your team.
And how about you, Bob? What's your favorite on the screen here?
I think it's that ski hill in the background. No, I think, joking aside, Hugh touched on it. A primary purpose of a leader is to convey competence and give the individuals you lead, that could be just yourself, it could be your family, it could be your work team, or it could be an organization, to give them hope that there is a future and that there is a path to that future. From my experience, the ultimate responsibility of a leader.
Yeah. Well, words well spoken. And what's interesting, Bob, is, I'd like to turn it over to you as well, because, the remainder of the presentation here is something that's, for those who want to advance their capabilities in business and in the organizations that you're part of. We'd like to stretch your thinking a little bit, wouldn't we? And it's interesting because there's a number of components, Bob, that, as we look through these 4 phases in leading organizations, what I can say for the rest of the call, for everybody on the call here today, if you're not in a position of leadership within an organization, you can certainly heed some information here to support the leaders of your team and to come together to truly be a team with some of these points. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I would agree, Pat. And we heard earlier in the quick survey that Pat did that most of you, from a personal perspective, are somewhere between 2 and 3, exiting response, but beginning to think about recovery. My experience working with a number of organizations recently is that's likely where most organizations are, somewhere between 2 and 3, beginning to think about what does the future look like and how do we get there. And I think, in the modern history of the human race, this is probably one of the most disruptive events ever. It literally affects potentially every person on the planet, and it literally affects the strategies of all of the various enterprises on the planet. A few of them positively, but most of them presented with a high degree of uncertainty, a high degree of change, and a lot of questions about what will the future look like. So from that perspective, we don't believe there is a general purpose plan, a roadmap for each company. That roadmap needs to be tailored based upon your business model, your choices around competing, staffing, supply chain. It's all very much needs to be bespoke to your firm. We know with a fair degree of certainty that organizations will need to change and adapt. We know supply chains, for many of you, probably already have been disrupted, and they will need to be put back together and de-risked. We talked about the inherent strategy will need to be examined and modified where necessary in order to, step 1, ensure survival, and step 2, return your company to a competitive position. And as we talked previously, Pat and Hugh and Scott, communications is absolutely vital, from the executive suite down to business unit leaders, down to individuals, work teams, and the change management plan to go with it. And then finally, we talked earlier about this is a very much unknown event in human history, and things will change, information will change, governmental plans will change, and we need to be very attentive to those changes and not get locked into a change plan that has suddenly become obsolete because of late-breaking changes in the environment.
All right. So a few considerations on this slide too, aren't there, Bob?
Yeah, we know already that how we work together has changed significantly in the short term and likely material changes in the long term. Working at a distance, working from home, figuring out how to work safely where people have to be closer together, changes in work practices to reduce crowding and the potential of the virus spread. And again, these are all changes we're seeing our clients begin to implement. And likely you are seeing those as well in your workplace. We're not making recommendations, we're making observations. And this is likely a very good example of a set of work practices that will likely be different until the coronavirus has been brought under control. So it could be a multi-year change to how we all work together.
Well, it's interesting. One point to make. I've had a few texts come in. I understand the chat feature isn't working for some who are on the call, and I hope it's because of the fact that I haven't done the update that Hugh did on Microsoft Teams earlier today. But our apologies to you if you have that, and feel free to text questions if you have them to 403-585-9601. Again, I'll put that on the screen. 9601. Feel free to text me directly, and I can actually pose your questions if you choose to from there. Nothing like a quick workaround and an 80% plan, right, Bob?
Yes, agile, adjust.
There we go. Well, it's interesting. A good plan has the following components, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the dual shock of the coronavirus and the oil price shock have not changed the fundamentals of strategy, which are shown here quite simply on this slide. You have a structure, which is where and how your firm chooses to compete. Is it on cost? Is it on innovation? Is it on customer intimacy? Which markets do you choose to be in? In which markets will you not choose to compete in? So those basic considerations all remain, but likely need to be reviewed, challenged, and adjusted in what the world will look like in the next couple of years as we work our way through the coronavirus. The framework is the set of processes and, to a lesser extent, organizational structure that your company has put together to gather input, continuously update the strategy, make capital allocation decisions, potentially decide that you might want to exit or enter new markets. And then finally, on the left is the processes that any firm uses to measure progress. How well are we doing against this strategy? What are the metrics in terms of financial performance, business unit performance, key activities that will get us to where we want to go over the next, say, 5 years as articulated within a strategy. So the fundamentals still remain, but structure, framework, more so are likely to change potentially materially because of the current business environment. Accountability to a large extent remains as usual.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, Bob. What a timely question to have come into my my cell here on text. The question is this: what are the questions we should be asking ourselves during this difficult time? And you know, it's a perfect timing for this, because let me switch to the first of the questions.
Yeah, so that's a great setup for the next several slides. So I think it's, first of all, it's understanding, dealing with the short term. Where has your strategy or your execution of your strategy been affected the most? What are the short-term actions that you need to take to get the business more or less back on a stable basis? And generally speaking, there are major areas that have been impacted in every firm. How people work together, how teams interact, the probably heightened demand for computer resources. Those of you who are in a manufacturing, drilling, operations business have likely already experienced problems with your supply chain. So how do you heal those gaps and at least put in interim solutions? Those of you who sell need to figure out pretty quickly, how do you sell at a distance? How do you interact with clients? And how do you stay on top of and keep customers informed where it's no longer convenient to meet someone for lunch or for dinner? So those, if you think about short term, those are some of the areas that likely most of your firms are dealing with the immediate in terms of responding first and then beginning to think about recovery.
Well, let's go to our second question then, because the second question is, which changes will be temporary going through price shock and COVID, and which are likely to be permanent?
Yeah. So we talked a bit about, I'll call it working with proper separation. You know, that's, I would guess, likely to fade away over the next several years, more so and probably quicker when a vaccine is proven and 60 or 70% of the population has developed immunity either through a vaccine or having had corona. So that's likely to be a midterm change. Supply chain is an example of an area that's pretty likely to be permanent. I think different firms and different industries are all discovering quite painfully disruptions in supply chain in terms of inability of manufacturers to deliver, the upset of working at separation on what are typically dense manufacturing facilities. And then the whole issue of if another pandemic occurs or if we have another disruption, how can we better get our arms physically, maybe within our respective countries' borders of the primary elements of the supply chain? So I think we're forecasting that the changes in supply chain are likely to be much more permanent. And then how you sell, how you manage customers, probably some of what we're implementing today will remain, but likely potentially to return to maybe 80% of the pre-coronavirus work processes. Okay, Pat?
Now, and the third question, Bob, is how do you develop an action plan, prioritize, and begin execution?
Yeah, so we advocate, thinking about where the immediate pain is. We advocate going back and looking at your company's strategy, and this may should be occurring at the executive level within each of your firms. And then coming out of that, we advocate putting together teams to focus on the critical areas around the 7 or so that we have here on the slide, but other areas that are critical to your company's operations and strategy execution, and putting together teams and empowering those teams to develop a plan with executive oversight and begin to execute that plan, because this helps at all levels, even at the team level. If you have a revised corporate strategy and that's translated down to line of sight to individuals and to team activities, then you as a leader or you as an individual can begin to work on activities that will affect positively the future of the company. It gives individuals control over their activities, their fate, and it gives them, as I said earlier, hope and promise in a positive outcome for what's going on. So our view is the change plan to adjust in the short term and also the longer term to the double shock of Corona and the price crash is to treat this plan as probably one of the most important initiatives your company has ever undertaken, because literally it's about 1, surviving, and 2, restoring your firm to a competitive position in the new future, which will definitely be different. We just don't know how different yet.
Well, it's interesting, Bob, because you put together. I know the print on here is a little bit small, but and when you're starting to think recovery, you're starting to think strategy. You get some processes, some risk factors, and an action plan to come out of it, don't you?
Yeah, and so we chose, and just as an illustrative example here, operations, because virtually every firm, I can't think of a firm that does not have a major operations activity work process. And this is the day-to-day execution of where you make your money. So every firm in the world today is probably re-examining the key elements of their operations work process. We have, just for the sake of this example, taken the key elements of oil and gas operations and broken them down at the high level, and then picked as an example supply chain, which is likely to be very, very high likelihood of being disrupted because of Corona. And so we advocate going through operations, but also another 6 or 7 processes that we'll show shortly, and then asking the question, what is the state of this operations process? How much has it been disrupted? In the case of supply chain, how are we doing in terms of current inventory levels on the right? Where have we lost suppliers? Where do we need to develop alternative suppliers? What are our plans to fill in the gaps? And then, because it's likely to be very high impact, where do we need to cut back, maybe defer like maintenance activities, such that we have the supplies, the critical skills, and the material to maintain our operations cash flow. So you can go through each of the major elements of operations, and then you can go through each of the major processes of your business to come up with the beginnings of a short-term plan to deal with Corona, which should then also lead to a long-term plan.
Well, Bob, it's interesting. I know that personally I'm going to rethink my supply chain on toilet paper after this whole situation is over. But, almost every organization out there is going through some changes in how they order and the just-in-time, stocking of different materials. And you even look at the difficulty people are having getting hand sanitizer or masks or gloves. It's a big change. One of the tools we put together that we've had for some time to help others with strategy, we call them our strategic pyramids. And the way to read these is one box at a time, using the legend of green, yellow, red by ranking each one of the areas. It may need a little bit of description, but starting with functional elements like your operations, equipment, and maintenance, and your standard operating procedures. How well are they documented on a 1 to 10? Your safety standards, are they current and active on a scale of 1 to 10? So to go through each one of these is what we typically do when we guide an organization through strategy, no matter what size. But you've highlighted a few of the more pertinent and more important boxes that are on these pyramids, right?
Yeah, and I'll call out several of them. So obviously on the left, foundational elements, safety standards. We all want to continue safe operations, but layered on top of safe operations is now safe working at a distance, safe working in the field, and that needs to be integrated and incorporated into the usual attention to safety. So that's definitely different. If we go over to the right, foundational elements again, procurement. We talked a bit about supply chain disruption. How do your firms respond to that? How do you heal the gaps in your supply chain? Pat mentioned just in time is probably going to take a step back and become maybe the opposite of having much higher safety stocks than firms that are traditionally incorporating today just to reduce the risk of another unexpected event. If you move over to the next column around maintenance, regulatory compliance, how teams work together, that all definitely will have a big corona impact. Working at a distance, how do you ensure regulatory compliance where maybe your ability to go to the field and inspect may be curtailed because of maybe supply chain issues? And then from a maintenance point of view, given your potential issues in supply of materials, what can and should be deferred, one, to accommodate supply chain disruptions, but also maybe lessen the close contact of maintenance workers who might need to do various craft skills like welding and pipe fitting. I think I talked a bit about safety. I talked a bit about contractor management. So
No, Bob,
another
sorry, Bob, another question just came in. It was a question around, the other functional, rows, work controls, work improvement, continuous improvement, and high functioning work efforts. Really, as we move up from foundational elements, why do we have these different rows to be considered from the bottom up?
Yeah, I think, as you look at I'll characterize it as the maturity of any operations work function. As you go up the pyramid, you become progressively more sophisticated in how do you monitor and control the work, how ingrained and systematic are your work improvement and continuous improvement processes. In less mature firms, continuous improvement is generally conducted by external contractors for existence. In top performing firms, continuous improvement is integral to the work activities and is a skill set that is generally trained and practiced within an organization. And if you get to the very top, not all firms, for example, have cross-functional teams who are charged specifically with operations excellence. So, as you move up the pyramid and as you approach what we call top tier performance, you will get higher scores in an assessment in the functional components on the left of operations excellence.
And thanks for that, Bob. And it's interesting because looking at different functions within the organization, we've just put the operations pyramid up as an example. Some of the other pyramids that we have built based on experience with strategy work with other organizations is for the overall commercial enterprise that you're part of. Some of you on the call maybe have a touch into or a responsibility in maintenance, in IT or technology, in marketing and communications. Maybe it's HR and talent, business development, or the one that's not showed on here is also finance. So you may have a responsibility, and we do have some of these strategic pyramids to assess where you're at and where you could go in different functional areas of the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, I think if you look at the two diagnostic tools we showed you, it's up, your option. If you want to use any of them at all, we're happy to send you the templates. But if you look at the example we went through as operations, if you look at operations from a functional excellence point of view, which is the pyramid we just talked about, and if you look at it from a primary work process point of view, you should get a fairly comprehensive understanding of what's been impacted, what needs to change, and what needs to remain the same in terms of charting the path back to return to normalcy.
Well, and Bob, just a few final comments on leading organizations through adversity. It's interesting. We've got some very important points on this slide as well.
Yeah, and I think, first and foremost, you have all heard this from Hugh and Pat and Scott. It's take care of your people first. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Listen, 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 and then convey confidence. You may not wake up in the morning every day and feel, enthusiastic and confident, but when you're in front of your teams, it's vitally important to project energy, because your teams will build off of your energy as a leader. We think that the recovery here is probably going to be multi-year. The wild card is how soon do we get a vaccine? So we advocate, planning for maybe a 2-year recovery, but be agile, be attentive to changes, and if a more rapid recovery becomes realistic, don't be left behind your competitors in terms of returning to normalcy. We talked earlier about your firm's response to the dual crisis here is probably the most critical challenge your firm has ever faced. So we recommend treating this as the most important project your company has ever worked on. You may not have impact at the executive level, but very likely, almost certain that the decisions made at that level will ripple down to you and your work team. And so we advocate understanding the implications of that strategy and translating it to specific actions at the work team or business organization level. The situation will change. Don't get locked into 100% solution. Be attentive to the changing environment. Be agile and adjust as indicated by the changing environment. We talked about communications, extremely important internally as well as externally to stakeholders, customers, and also the media. Have a plan to communicate through the various social media methods, Twitter, Facebook, etc. Make sure your company has an external voice. That's real important. And then I like to close with a learning from one of my mentors who was a Major General in the U.S. Army, 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, multiple medals. His saying, and also a very successful entrepreneur who had created a couple large companies, his saying is the best way out is through. And we think that's very applicable to the current environment. And we won't get to where we want to go by waiting. We will get there by taking action. So with that, Pat, I will conclude the discussion on strategy.
Well, thanks for that, Bob. And it's interesting because now that we've covered tips on leading yourself, leading your families and teams through adversity, and also a little bit of insight to help us look around within the organizations that we're part of to help out with some of the planning and the strategy. It's interesting because one item we'd like to put up on the screen right now, we continue to help other organizations with their strategic planning and with some of the training requirements that might be there. We'll include this information at the end of the deck. And we also do have a partnership with SAIT. We're working together with SAIT for reasons of strategic planning. SAIT has a number of topics that are included at the end of this as well for different support and programs for your respective organizations. The interesting thing I'd like to just suggest right now is the email that's up on the screen right now, info@envisiongroup.ca. If you'd like to email us, we'll send you a copy of this deck. Make sure you have that and that you've got that to really to present forward to anybody else within your organization to take tools and ideas out of this. But the big thing I'd like to say is just a huge thanks for everybody on the call today, for everyone who made the time for today's call. Thank you so much for making the time. We know it's been a tricky environment to navigate. Hugh, any closing comments from you before we wrap up?
No, just I thought that I think we got the main ideas across. The issue is just be agile, get as much information as you can about your environment, analyze it, and then as Bob said, the best way to overcome this is go through it. And to get through it, you need to have a plan in place that is appropriate for your organization. All
right. And Scott, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I'll just echo what you just said, Pat. Thanks to everyone for taking time out of their day to join us today. I would maybe make the point that no one said that leadership was always easy, and they don't teach you leadership, how to lead through a pandemic. So obviously, a lot of people are learning as we go, and hopefully, some of the tidbits that were shared today on the call are a couple of nuggets you can take away with you to help you as you manage through this situation. And be well.
Okay, and just to say thanks to everybody. Thank you very much again for making the time today. We're wishing all our very best moving forward. If there's anything we can do to support or assist or even deliver a presentation such as this to others within your respective organizations, please let us know. info@envisiongroup.ca. We look forward to getting your emails and to forwarding a copy of the presentation deck to you. We just wanted to say thank you, and all of our best as you move forward, all of our best of health and safety as you move forward in this tricky climate. And thank you very much for making time today.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.